I'm Ramesh Nithiyendran. I'm an artist based in Sydney. I make large-scale sculptural installations primarily. So usually what I'll do is I'll be working towards exhibitions, and these exhibitions usually involve a number of handmade works amongst a number of, I guess, I don't like the word interventions, but I guess editing or intervening with the gallery space to kind of create an immersive experience for the audience. It's kind of interesting because I've made lots of work, and often, like I always say, that the use of the phallus in the work is rhetorical. So I'm using the symbol to talk about other issues, and my belief is that using the phallus or kind of shining light on representations in the phallus has this kind of social and political purpose, because very fundamentally, like if you argue that the world is still fairly patriarchal, one of the key symbols of patriarchy is the phallus. I think they've been really prominent and I guess socially sanctioned representations of erect penises, specifically within various, Western contexts, ancient ones. So like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, you have these decorative pots with, these graphic sexual depictions between males, for example, all over them. In ancient Rome, you had like these phallic pendants hanging from houses. So this kind of symbolism of like overt kind of erect penises has been around like for a long time in a Western society. If you kind of go back into an Eastern context as well, these depictions are featured quite prominently in religious contexts, particularly in something like Hinduism. If you go to India, for example, or various parts of Indonesia which still practice Hinduism, there are lots of kind of sculptures of, large phalluses, essentially, which kind of feature in their like religious sculptural paradigm. I think currently there is this sense of fear around overt representations of the male body. I think as a Western society, we're quite comfortable with commoditizing and packaging women's bodies. Like even if you go to an art gallery, for example, they'll always have this kind of 18th century like Western paintings, and there's just like breasts and crotches and these kind of women's bodies like in states of undress are kind of naturalized, and people are expected to see them and fairly unthreatened. And I guess if you go from an art context into an advertising context, you have this kind of replaying where these images of women's bodies are fairly, omnipresent, as these kinds of sites of consumption. But what's really interesting, even if you go into things like film, images of the phallus is still highly censored. They cause a lot of stir. Often, when you have school groups and we do life drawing, it's often always a female model, based on this kind of fundamental belief that the female model will have people be more comfortable than have this kind of penis in the room. So I think it kind of links to this idea that, in a way, like keeping these images fairly, mystified or hidden kind of adds to the empowerment of them. I think once we kind of get a handle on representing them meaningfully, then we can start to kind of, dismantle some of its power. So a lot of the sculptures I make have elements of both genders. I don't really like using binary terms to describe genders anyway, but this is kind of what's been talked about in terms of them. And I think it comes down to this whole idea that I'm engaging with sexual symbolism, or what people perceive to be sexual symbolism. So in lots of the work, I think, like lots of the figures, like if they're representing a thing, it might have, wide hips or a phallus and breasts, or I'm not kind of too concerned about like representing bodies of specific genders. From the context of challenging, political and social structures, I'm often skeptical of people, who sometimes make these grand claims about art as challenging power structures and making these grand claims about the difference they're making, because I'm not like it's not a vaccine. You can't empirically verify the change you're making by making a sculpture. Do you know what I mean? But I think what's interesting is that often artists are able to create dialogues around certain ideas, and they're the ones who start those things. Creation myths within most societies play this really important function as kind of these central stories to structure how we function and exist and correlate as societies. So I thought kind of presenting this creation thing that was, chaotic, kind of celebratory, a bit queer, kind of past, present, future, like merging the East, merging the West, was almost like this utopian way to, conceive like a story that to start the world. So rather than start with order, start with like happy chaos, which will kind of allow everything else to fall into place. The other thing that I always think about is if you're an artist and you're having a show, there's this kind of narcissistic dimension because you are the primary producer. It's your name, it's your work. So I think kind of positioning myself as this mythic creator thing was almost like required to talk about the ideas I want to talk about. The other thing is I think it's important to have a sense of joy or celebration to art a lot of the time. I think there's this real sense, that there's like the world is fairly dire and often like political art in lots of respects kind of, replicates that dire like thing. And I kind of think it's perhaps like my view is the art I want to kind of make is one that kind of is more joyful in that respect. So it can function as a critique, but at the same time there can be kind of joy and pleasure in the viewing experience and the consumption of it.